History balances on a razor's edge. One different decision in an ancient battle could have transformed our world beyond recognition. This journey uncovers 25 conflicts where victory and defeat hung by a thread. You will discover how a single day of fighting shaped the languages we speak and the nations we know. What if democracy had been crushed in its cradle? What if an empire had fallen 1,000 years earlier? By the end, you will see the delicate tapestry of our past and the stunning alternative realities that were almost our own. What kind of world do you think we nearly inherited? Instead, the dusty plain of Marathon was the thin line separating two futures. In 490 before the Common Era, a vast Persian fleet landed an army on the coast of Attica, its goal to punish the upstart city of Athens for supporting a rebellion. The Persian Empire was the superpower of its day, a colossal force that stretched from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. Its king, Darius, commanded an army of professional soldiers, archers, and cavalry that vastly outnumbered the Athenian force. For Athens, this was not merely a fight for territory. It was a fight for its very soul, a defense of a radical new experiment in human organization, a system called democracy. The idea that citizens could govern themselves rather than bow to a king was fragile and new. A Persian victory would have extinguished that idea almost as soon as it was born. The entire political and cultural trajectory of the West balanced on the edge of a spear. Imagine the Athenian commanders, Miltiades and Callimachus, surveying the field. The Persians held a strong position, their cavalry a constant threat. The hoplites, the citizen soldiers of Athens, stood in their bronze armor, each man a farmer, a potter, a merchant. They were not professional warriors, they were the democracy itself, standing in a phalanx, a wall of shields and spears. Their plan was audacious, born of desperation. Instead of holding their ground, they charged. They ran across the open plain, a distance of over a mile, directly into a storm of Persian arrows. This was a shocking, unprecedented tactic. The impact was devastating. The Athenian center deliberately weakened to draw in the Persian forces while the stronger wings encircled them. It was a perfect trap. The Persian line shattered. In the chaos, the invaders fled back to their ships, leaving thousands dead on the field. But what if a single arrow had found Miltiades before the order was given? What if the Persian cavalry had been deployed just a moment sooner? A Persian triumph at Marathon would have been absolute. Athens would have been sacked, its people enslaved, its fledgling democratic government replaced by a puppet ruler loyal to a distant king. Without the confidence born from this victory, would the Athenians have built the Parthenon? Would Socrates have questioned the youth in the Agora? Would the plays of Sophocles ever have been performed? The intellectual and artistic explosion that defined classical Greece, the very foundation of Western thought, required the freedom that was secured on that one sweltering afternoon. The world we know began with a long run across a dusty plain. A Persian victory at Marathon would have sent shockwaves far beyond that single battlefield. The Greek world would have been absorbed into a vast, centralized empire, its independent city-states replaced by satrapies answering to a king in Persepolis. The fierce competition between Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, the very rivalry that drove their cultural and military innovations, would have been extinguished. There would have been no golden age of Athenian philosophy, no Parthenon crowning the Acropolis as a monument to democratic pride. The plays of Aeschylus, who himself fought at Marathon, would never have been written. The intellectual energy that produced Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle required the open, contentious air of free city-states, not the obedient silence of an imperial province. This cultural collapse would have fundamentally altered the world to the West. A weakened, fragmented Greece could never have served as the cradle for Alexander the Great's later campaigns. There would have been no Hellenistic world, no vast network of cities spreading Greek language, art, and science from Egypt to the borders of India. the Roman Republic, still a rising power in Italy, would have encountered a profoundly different Eastern Mediterranean. Instead of being captivated and conquered by Greek culture, adopting its gods, its philosophy, and its architectural styles, Rome would have faced the monolithic power of Persia directly. Would Rome have expanded eastward at all against such a consolidated empire, or would its entire destiny have been channeled westward? The Roman legions, the Latin language, the very concept of a republic and later an empire that shaped Europe, all developed in a world where Greek ideas provided a crucial foundation. Without that foundation, the map of Europe, its languages, its laws, and its identity would be unrecognizable to us today. The long run at Marathon did not just save a city. It preserved the unique conditions that allowed an entire civilization to flourish and, in turn, seed the world that came after. Yet that very Athenian spirit, born from the victory at Marathon, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The Golden Age of Pericles, with its magnificent art and soaring philosophy, was built upon an empire of subject states and tributes. This wealth and power cast a long shadow, one that fell directly upon the austere, militaristic city of Sparta. For nearly 30 years, these two rival systems, democracy and oligarchy, locked in a struggle that would consume the entire Greek world. The Peloponnesian War was a grinding, brutal conflict, a slow bleed that exhausted the very heart of Hellenic civilization. Athens, secure behind its legendary long walls and powered by its dominant navy, believed it was untouchable, but pride often walks hand in hand with disaster. The turning point came not in a straightforward battle, but in a grandiose gamble far from home, the disastrous Sicilian expedition. Driven by dreams of limitless wealth and a strategic masterstroke that would cripple Sparta, Athens launched a massive armada to conquer the powerful city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily. It was an adventure of staggering scale and ambition. Imagine the sight as the triremes set sail, their bronze rams gleaming, carrying the best hoplites and cavalry Athens could muster. The entire city was intoxicated by the prospect of easy glory, but the expedition was a cascade of failures. Poor leadership, underestimated enemies, and sheer bad luck plagued the campaign from the start. The Athenians found Syracuse not a ripe fruit ready to fall, but a hardened fortress, its walls strengthened by the brilliant Spartan general Gylippus. The mighty Athenian fleet was trapped and destroyed in the city's great harbor. On land, the army was cut off, surrounded, and forced into a desperate, humiliating retreat. The entire force was utterly annihilated, either slaughtered or enslaved in Sicilian quarries. It was a loss from which Athenian power, wealth, and morale never recovered. So what if that fleet had never sailed? What if a more cautious counsel had prevailed in Athens, or a single storm had delayed the departure? A victorious Sicilian expedition would have transformed the Mediterranean. With the resources of Sicily and a stranglehold on grain routes, the Athenian Empire could have become an unassailable maritime power. Sparta, landlocked and financially strained, would have been forced to sue for peace. The Parthenon's treasury would have overflowed for generations. The cultural golden age, the world of Plato's Academy and Aristophanes' comedies, might have continued for another century, perhaps even spreading its influence westward. Without the catastrophic drain of the Peloponnesian War, a unified Greece under Athenian leadership could have presented a far more formidable obstacle to the rising power in the West. The legions of Rome, when they eventually looked east, would have encountered not a collection of war-weary, fractured city-states, but a cohesive and wealthy Hellenic superstate. The course of history did not turn on a single spear thrust here, but on a single, fateful vote in an Athenian assembly, a decision that sent a glorious armada to its ruin and dimmed the lights of a golden age. The disaster in Sicily left Athens broken, but the embers of Greek ambition still glowed, waiting for a wind to fan them into a world-consuming fire. That wind came in the form of a young king from the northern fringe of the Greek world, Alexander of Macedon. In a breathtakingly short campaign, he shattered the Persian Empire, avenging the invasions of centuries past and carrying Greek culture to the very borders of the known world. But his greatest test and the most tantalizing what-if awaited him not in the Persian heartland, but at the edge of a monsoon-swollen river in a land of elephants and unknown kingdoms. The Hydaspes River in the year 326 before the Common Era was a torrential barrier. On the far bank stood King Porus, a giant of a man commanding a formidable army, its battle lines anchored by war elephants, creatures the Macedonians had never faced in such numbers. Alexander's veterans, the men who had marched with him from Greece through Egypt and Persia, were exhausted. They had been away from home for nearly a decade. Yet their king's ambition was undimmed. In a brilliant night maneuver during a violent thunderstorm, Alexander led a large part of his force across the raging river, outflanking Porus' defenses. The battle was a masterpiece of tactical adaptation. Alexander's cavalry harried the Indian flanks while his infantry, the legendary phalanx, bravely advanced against the terrifying charge of the elephants. They used their long sarissa spears to wound the great beasts, creating chaos in the Indian ranks. It was a hard-fought victory, but a complete one. So impressed was Alexander by Porus' valor that he reinstated him as a governor, a signature move in his strategy of fusion. But then Alexander looked east. He wanted to press on to cross the next great river, the Ganges, and conquer the vast, wealthy empires rumored to lie beyond. His soldiers, however, had reached their limit. The monsoons were unending, the land was strange, and the rumors of massive Indian armies waiting with thousands more war elephants finally broke their spirit. They mutinied. It was the first and only time his army refused him. With a heavy heart, Alexander was forced to turn back. This moment of refusal is one of history's great hinges. What if his loyal veterans had mustered one more ounce of resolve? What if they had followed their king across the Ganges? Historians believe he would have encountered the powerful Nanda Empire, a kingdom that could indeed field a colossal army. But Alexander was a master of exploiting political divisions, and the Nanda Empire was reportedly ripe with internal discontent. A victory, however difficult, was not impossible. Had he succeeded, the entire Indian subcontinent could have been woven into his burgeoning empire. The fusion of Greek and Indian culture would have been profound and permanent. We might have seen Greek-style cities rising on the banks of the Ganges, statues of Zeus sharing temple space with Shiva, and the philosophical traditions of Aristotle influencing the early development of Buddhism and Hinduism. A Greco-Indian empire could have created a continuous superstate from the Adriatic Sea to the Bay of Bengal, altering trade, science, and religion for a millennium. The legions of Rome, when they eventually rose, would have faced a unified Hellenistic East of unimaginable scale and power, potentially halting their expansion entirely. The world was reshaped not by a battle Alexander won, but by a march his army refused to make. Rome's greatest nightmare arrived not by sea, but from the north, crossing the snow-choked passes of the Alps with a ghost army and a herd of war elephants. Hannibal Barca, sworn from childhood to be an enemy of Rome, had accomplished the impossible. For 16 years he roamed Italy at will, a phantom general who repeatedly outmaneuvered and annihilated the legions sent to crush him. His masterstroke came on a hot summer day in the year 216 before the Common Era, on the plains of Cannae. There he faced a Roman force nearly twice the size of his own. The Roman commanders, confident in their overwhelming numbers, pressed for a direct, crushing assault. They believed their deep ranks would simply push through the thinner Carthaginian line. Hannibal understood this arrogance perfectly. He designed a trap of breathtaking audacity. He placed his weakest infantry in the center, in a crescent that bulged toward the Romans. As he anticipated, the Roman legions drove into this center with immense force, thinking they were on the verge of a breakthrough. They did not realize they were pushing into a carefully designed sack. As the Roman mass compressed inward, Hannibal's veteran African infantry on the flanks swung inwards like two great doors. At the same moment, his superb cavalry, having routed the Roman horse, closed the trap from the rear. The Roman army was completely surrounded, packed so tightly that men could not lift their arms to wield their swords. It was not a battle, it was a systematic slaughter. By the end of the day, as many as 70,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, a loss of life so staggering it remains a grim lesson in military academies to this day. The road to Rome itself now lay open, utterly undefended. Hannibal's cavalry commander, Maharbal, famously pleaded with him to march on the capital immediately, declaring that in 5 days he could feast in the Roman Forum. But Hannibal hesitated. He chose not to press the advantage. This single decision is one of the most debated moments in military history. Why did he hold back? His army was exhausted from the fight. He lacked the heavy siege equipment necessary to breach Rome's formidable walls. He may have believed that such a stunning defeat would shatter the Roman Confederation, causing its Italian allies to desert and sue for peace. It was a calculated political gamble, but it was a gamble he lost. Rome did not break. Instead, it demonstrated a terrifying resilience, raising new armies and refusing to negotiate while a foreign enemy stood on Italian soil. So what if Hannibal had listened to Maharbal? What if, in the chaotic aftermath of Cannae, with Roman morale in ruins and the city in a panic, he had marched those final miles and laid siege to the capital? A direct assault may have failed, but the mere sight of Carthaginian standards before the gates might have been the final push needed to break the Roman spirit and, more importantly, trigger the mass defection of its allies. With its supply lines cut and its manpower pool evaporating, Rome would have been starved into surrender. A victorious Carthage would have dictated the terms of peace, dismantling the Roman Republic and establishing its own mercantile empire across the Mediterranean. The Latin language might have faded into a local dialect, never to spawn the Romance languages of French, Spanish, and Italian. The legal and architectural concepts that Rome would later gift to the world, from aqueducts to the principles of law, might have remained undeveloped or taken a completely different form under Carthaginian influence, a civilization focused more on commerce than conquest and administration. The entire foundation of Western Europe was saved not by a victory on the battlefield, but by one general's fateful pause outside the gates of a terrified city. A world without Rome is almost impossible to conceive. The Latin alphabet you are reading now, the legal principles underpinning modern justice, the very roads and aqueducts that became the blueprint for European infrastructure, all trace their lineage back to the 7 hills beside the Tiber. Had Hannibal's standards been planted in the Roman Forum, that lineage would have been severed at the root. The Mediterranean would have become a Carthaginian lake, its shores dotted with trading posts and its culture defined not by Roman law but by Phoenician commerce. The Carthaginian aristocracy were merchants first and conquerors second. Their empire was a network of coastal cities and trade routes designed for controlling the flow of tin, silver, and exotic goods, not for administering vast inland territories. Imagine a world map where the deep, unifying red of the Roman Empire is replaced by a thin, coastal ribbon of Punic influence. Would there have been a need for a network of stone-paved roads connecting Britain to Syria? Probably not. Carthage's power was based on its fleet, and its interest lay in controlling ports, not pacifying entire continents. The great continental highways that later allowed for the rapid movement of Roman legions, Christian missionaries, and medieval merchants might never have been built. The economic and cultural integration of Europe would have been profoundly slower if it happened at all. Languages would have evolved along a completely different path. Latin, without the might of the Roman Empire to spread it, would have remained a local dialect in central Italy. The Romance languages of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian simply would not exist. Instead, you might be hearing a descendant of the Punic language, a Semitic tongue related to Hebrew, spoken across North Africa and the Western Mediterranean. The religious landscape of Europe would be equally alien. The Roman pantheon of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, which so heavily influenced the names of our planets and days of the week, was already deeply intertwined with Greek mythology. A Carthaginian world would have elevated its own gods like Baal Hammon and Tanit, whose worship sometimes involved practices the Romans found abhorrent. More significantly, the stable, unified empire that later provided the perfect conditions for the spread of Christianity would never have formed. The Apostle Paul, a Roman citizen, used Roman roads and the relative safety of the Pax Romana to carry his message across the known world. Without that vast, interconnected empire, would Christianity have remained an obscure Jewish sect, its message fragmented and confined to the Eastern Mediterranean? The rise of Islam centuries later would have played out against a completely different political backdrop, potentially altering the history of three continents. Our world was built not just by what Rome achieved, but by what Carthage, in its moment of ultimate triumph, chose not to do. The hesitation outside the gates of Rome echoes through millennia, a reminder that the fate of empires is often decided not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet calculation that follows. The fate of Rome, spared by Hannibal's hesitation, now faced a different kind of test in the wild, forested north. Far from the marble halls of the Senate, an ambitious general named Julius Caesar was forging his own destiny in the land of the Gauls. His campaign was more than a simple military conquest. It was a brutal 9-year-long project of subjugation that would fill his coffers with gold and his legions with fanatical loyalty, providing the very tools he would later use to dismantle the Republic itself. The climax of this epic struggle came at a fortified hilltop in central Gaul, a place called Alesia. Here, the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, having united the often feuding tribes, made his stand. He pulled his vast army inside the stronghold, confident that the rugged terrain and his superior numbers would be his salvation. Caesar, however, responded with one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. Instead of a simple assault, he ordered his legions to build. They constructed two massive concentric walls of earth and timber, one facing inward to besiege Alesia, and another facing outward to guard against the enormous relief army they knew was coming. The Romans were now the besiegers and the besieged, a thin line of fortifications holding back the entire fury of Gaul. Inside Alesia, conditions grew desperate. Vercingetorix was forced to expel the women and children from the town, a heartbreaking attempt to save food for his warriors. They were left to starve in the no-man's land between the walls, their fate a grim testament to the war's brutality. When the Gallic relief force finally arrived, it launched a series of massive, coordinated attacks from both inside and outside the Roman lines. The battle surged back and forth for days, a chaotic melee of sword and spear against the wooden palisades. At several points, the Gallic warriors, fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland, came agonizingly close to breaking through. The Roman line was stretched to its absolute limit. What if one of those furious charges had found a weak spot in the defenses? What if a single gate had given way under the relentless pressure? A Gallic victory at Alesia would have been catastrophic for Caesar. His army, the foundation of his power, would have been annihilated. He himself would likely have been killed or disgraced. His political career in Rome ended in infamy. Without the immense wealth and legendary reputation he gained in Gaul, he would have returned to Rome as just another senator, lacking the resources and loyal veterans to challenge the Senate and cross the Rubicon River. The civil war that ended the Roman Republic might never have happened. The system of consuls and senators, however corrupt, could have stumbled on for decades more, perhaps even centuries. There would have been no Augustus, no Pax Romana, no imperial system that provided a stable framework for the spread of laws, languages, and Christianity across Europe. The political DNA of the Western world, with its deep roots in Roman law and administration, would be entirely different. The rise of Julius Caesar was not an inevitability. It was a possibility that hinged on the desperate defense of a set of wooden walls in a distant land, a victory that secured not just Gaul, but the very future of imperial Rome. Even with Gaul subdued, the republic Caesar returned to save was already a hollow shell. The old alliance between its three most powerful men, the so-called triumvirate, had shattered. Pompey, once Caesar's son-in-law and partner, now sided with the conservative faction in the Senate, the Optimates, who viewed Caesar's ambition as a disease threatening the state itself. The Senate issued an ultimatum, command him to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, a move that would leave him defenseless before his enemies. For Caesar, crossing the Rubicon River with a single legion was not an act of war, but a desperate gamble for dignity and survival. This was not a foreign invasion, but a Roman civil war, a brutal family quarrel that would decide the fate of a 500-year-old republic. The final confrontation came on the dusty plains of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey's army was larger, better supplied, and held the high ground. His strategy was logical: to let Caesar's men exhaust themselves in an uphill charge and then crush them with his superior cavalry. But logic often fails in the face of genius. Caesar, anticipating this very plan, secretly pulled cohorts from his third line and formed a fourth line, hiding them at an angle to his main force. When Pompey's cavalry, thousands strong, swept around the flank expecting to roll up Caesar's line, this hidden reserve stood up and attacked not with javelins, but with their spears thrust like pikes at the faces of the horsemen and their mounts. It was a shocking, demoralizing tactic. The proud cavalry broke and fled. With the flank secure, Caesar ordered his veteran third line, men who had rested through the initial fighting, to advance. They hit Pompey's weary main line with the force of a hammer, and the entire Optimates' army disintegrated. Pompey fled the field, and with him the last best hope for the Republic's old guard. So what if the dice had fallen differently that day? What if Pompey's cavalry had held, or his infantry had repelled that final, devastating charge? A victory for the Optimates at Pharsalus would have been a victory for the Senate and the established oligarchy. Caesar would have been killed or executed, his name cursed as a traitor. The political structure that had governed Rome for centuries, however corrupt and unequal, would have been preserved. The concentration of power in the hands of a single man, the very definition of an emperor, would have been postponed perhaps for generations. Without Caesar, there is no clear path for his grandnephew and heir Octavian to rise to power. There is no Augustus to become the first emperor, no Julio-Claudian dynasty, no Pax Romana that brought 2 centuries of stability to the Mediterranean world. The Republic might have stumbled on a dysfunctional system of bickering aristocrats incapable of managing the vast territories Rome now controlled. This weak and fractured republic would have been a far different opponent for the Parthian Empire in the east or the Germanic tribes along the Rhine. The great projects of the early empire, the massive building programs, the professionalization of the army, the codification of laws that would influence the world for millennia might never have been undertaken. The crucifixion of a certain religious teacher in the minor province of Judea would have remained a local event, his followers struggling to spread their message without the unified, peaceful empire that provided the roads and the common language for their mission. The Republic died not with a whisper in the Senate House, but in the roar of a cavalry charge that failed, on a field where one man's gamble saved his life and sealed the fate of an entire political world. The death of the Republic gave birth to an empire, but that empire's reach was not infinite. Its expansion northward into the wild, forested lands of Germania was a project of decades, a slow push to bring civilization, as Rome defined it, to the tribes beyond the Rhine. By the year 9 of the Common Era, it seemed this goal was within reach. The legions had established forts and were actively Romanizing the region, imposing their laws, their language, and their taxes. The local chieftains appeared to be cooperating, none more so than a young man named Arminius. He was a prince of the Cherusci tribe, but he had been raised in Rome as a hostage, given a military education, and even granted the prized status of Roman citizen and equestrian. He was the perfect ally, a man who understood both worlds, and he was a perfect trap. In the deep, rain-soaked Teutoburg forest, Arminius sprung that trap. He had gained the trust of the Roman governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus, leading him to believe a minor rebellion was brewing that required the show of force from 3 full legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th. Varus, arrogant and unprepared, marched his army of 20,000 men, along with a long train of camp followers, directly into the path Arminius had chosen. The forest itself was the enemy. The narrow paths forced the Romans into a thin, vulnerable column, unable to form their battle lines. The ground, churned by a torrential downpour, was a bog that swallowed sandals and carts. Then from the mist and the trees, the Germans struck. They did not offer a stand-up fight. They hit the column from all sides with javelins and spears, then melted back into the impenetrable woods. For 3 days, this nightmarish gauntlet continued. The Romans, encumbered by their heavy armor and discipline designed for open fields, were systematically butchered. There was no glorious last stand, only a desperate, bloody slog through a mud-choked hell. By the end, not a single legionary escaped. The 3 eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, were lost. When the news reached the aging Emperor Augustus, he was said to have wandered his palace crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The psychological blow was as devastating as the military one. Rome's northward expansion was finished. The Rhine River would become the permanent, fortified border of the empire. So what if Varus had been more cautious? What if he had heeded the warnings of other chieftains who tried to alert him to Arminius's betrayal? A Roman victory in the Teutoburg forest, or simply the avoidance of the ambush, would have changed the entire geography of Europe. Germania would have been fully incorporated as a Roman province. The process of Latinization that had transformed Gaul into France would have occurred here too. The Germanic dialects would have been supplanted by a form of Latin, meaning German, Dutch, and the Scandinavian languages as we know them might never have developed. Instead, you would have a Romance language spoken from the Rhine to the Elbe River. This Latinized Germania would have been a buffer, absorbing the pressure from tribes further east. The great migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries, the movement of peoples like the Goths and Vandals that so strained and ultimately broke the Western Roman Empire, might have been contained or diverted. The sack of Rome in 410, the fall of the last emperor in 476, these events might have been postponed for centuries or perhaps never happened at all. The Roman Empire, with the vast manpower and resources of a pacified Germania, could have endured, shaping a world where the Dark Ages never descended. The course of European history was carved not on a field of open battle, but in the silent, treacherous depths of a German forest, where the dream of a Roman Germany died with the loss of 3 eagles. The Roman eagle cast a long shadow over Judea, a land simmering with a faith that refused to bow. In the year 66 of the Common Era, that simmering resentment boiled over into a full-scale rebellion. Jewish zealots, driven by a fervent belief in their divine right to self-rule, managed to expel the Roman garrison from Jerusalem. It was a stunning, temporary victory that invited a terrifying response. The empire, under the future Emperor Vespasian and then his son Titus, moved with methodical, crushing force. By the year 70, the rebellion was cornered within the walls of its holy capital, Jerusalem. The ensuing siege was not merely a military operation, it was a collision of 2 worlds, one earthly and one divine. For the Jewish defenders, the city was the dwelling place of God himself, centered on the magnificent Second Temple. For the Romans, it was a fortress of stubborn rebels that needed to be made an example of. The siege dragged on for months, a horror of famine, internal strife among the Jewish factions, and relentless Roman engineering. Titus built a massive circumvallation wall, sealing the city's fate. When the walls were finally breached, the final battle centered on the Temple Mount. The order was given and the sanctuary was set ablaze. The destruction was total. The temple, the heart of Jewish religious life for nearly 600 years, was reduced to rubble. Its treasures were carried off to Rome, famously depicted on the Arch of Titus, and the Jewish people were scattered, a diaspora that would last for 2 millennia. But what if a different path had been taken? What if the more moderate Jewish leadership had succeeded in negotiating a peace before the siege tightened its grip? A settlement, however humiliating, would have allowed the temple to remain standing. With the physical center of their faith intact, the religious evolution of Judaism would have taken a radically different course. The focus would not have shifted so completely to the synagogues and the rabbinic class, the scribes and scholars who rebuilt Jewish life around prayer and study in the absence of a temple. The entire body of rabbinic Judaism, the Mishnah and the Talmud, which provided a new framework for living a Jewish life without sacrifices, might never have developed in the same way. The temple's survival would have preserved the power of the priestly class and the centrality of ritual sacrifice, creating a much more conservative and centralized religious authority. And what of the small, nascent movement forming within Judaism, the followers of an executed teacher from Nazareth? In its earliest days, Christianity was just one of many Jewish sects. The destruction of the temple was a cataclysm for all Jews, but for the Christians, it was also a profound theological event. They interpreted it as divine punishment for the Jewish rejection of Jesus and as a sign that God's covenant had now passed to a new spiritual temple, the Church. This interpretation was a critical force in the eventual split between Christianity and Judaism. Had the temple remained, how would this relationship have evolved? Would Christianity have remained a sect within a broader, temple-centered Judaism, its message continually refined and perhaps tempered through dialogue and debate with the established priesthood? Without the clear physical rupture of the temple's destruction, the two faiths might have developed along parallel or even intertwined paths for centuries longer. The very identity of the Western world, built upon a clear separation between church and synagogue, was forged in the fires that consumed a single holy building. The fate of empires can turn on a vision. In the year 312, 2 men stood on the brink of civil war, each claiming the right to rule the Western Roman Empire. Constantine, son of a previous emperor, advanced from the north with his battle-hardened legions. His rival, Maxentius, waited for him in Rome, protected by the city's legendary walls and the swollen Tiber River. The stage was set for a final confrontation at the Milvian Bridge, a stone crossing that became the threshold of a new world. Constantine was the underdog, outnumbered and forced to attack a heavily fortified position. But on the eve of the battle, he reportedly experienced a divine sign. Accounts differ, but the story that echoed through history tells of a vision in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "In this sign conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi-Rho, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek, on their shields. It was a desperate gamble, aligning his cause with a once persecuted minority faith. Maxentius, for reasons still debated by historians, made a catastrophic decision. He abandoned his defensive advantage and marched his army out of Rome to meet Constantine on the far side of the Tiber. The battle was a brutal, close-quarters struggle on the narrow approach to the bridge. Constantine's troops, perhaps inspired by their new emblem, fought with ferocious conviction. The lines of Maxentius broke, and in the chaotic retreat, the bridge itself became a death trap. Maxentius, weighed down by his armor, fell into the river and drowned. His body was pulled from the mud the next day, a grim trophy that cemented Constantine's victory. But what if Maxentius had simply stayed behind his walls? What if a single Roman javelin had found Constantine instead? A victory for Maxentius would have meant more than just a change of emperor. It would have been a triumph for the old Roman gods, for the traditional paganism that had guided the empire for centuries. Constantine's conversion, a deeply personal event that grew into a world-changing policy, would never have happened. Without his patronage, Christianity would have remained one of many mystery cults vying for attention in the vast Roman world. There would have been no Edict of Milan, which granted religious tolerance to Christians. There would have been no Council of Nicaea, where bishops from across the empire gathered at the emperor's request to define the core doctrines of the faith. The powerful fusion of church and state, a partnership that would define Europe for the next 1,000 years, would never have been forged. The very Bible you might hold in your hands, its canonical books solidified under imperial influence, could be a profoundly different collection of texts. The architectural landscape of the world would be unrecognizable. Without imperial funding and symbolic adoption, the great basilicas of Rome, the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and the thousands of churches that eventually dotted Europe might never have been built. The cultural and intellectual energy of the late Roman world, instead of being channeled into Christian theology and monastic preservation of texts, might have continued to flow into the philosophical schools of Neoplatonism or the state cults of the emperors. The rise of Islam in the 7th century would have encountered a Roman Empire still devoted to its ancient pantheon, a confrontation not between two monotheistic faiths, but between a new religion and a very old one. The cross was lifted high not through inevitability, but because one man saw a sign in the sky and another chose to leave the safety of his walls, a decision that redirected the spiritual destiny of the Western world. The Roman Empire had adopted a new god, but it could not escape its old fears. Just over half a century after Constantine's victory, a crisis was brewing along the Danube frontier, a direct consequence of that very same empire. A vast multitude of Gothic refugees fleeing the terrifying advance of the Huns arrived at the river and pleaded for sanctuary. They were desperate, and the Eastern Roman Emperor Valens saw an opportunity. He granted them entry, but his administration was corrupt and inept. Roman officials exploited the starving Goths, charging them exorbitant prices for dog meat and even forcing them to sell their own children into slavery in exchange for food. The predictable result was a furious rebellion. The Goths, now seasoned by their flight and armed with Roman weapons, rampaged through the province of Thrace. Valens, eager for a military triumph to bolster his prestige, marched out from his capital in Constantinople to crush them. He was confident, dismissive of the Gothic threat, and refused to wait for reinforcements from his co-emperor in the west. Near the city of Adrianople, he found the Gothic wagon circle, a mobile fortress on the plains. The late summer heat in 378 was oppressive. Valens, perhaps arrogant from past campaigns against less organized foes, ordered an immediate assault. His legions, tired from a long march in heavy armor, advanced directly on the Gothic position. It was a fatal error, as the Roman infantry engaged the wagon logger, a massive force of Gothic cavalry which had been out foraging returned to the field. They crashed into the flank and rear of the Roman army with the force of a thunderclap. The legions were packed too tightly to maneuver. The battle dissolved into a massacre. Emperor Valens himself was struck down, his body never recovered. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army lay dead on the field, a military disaster on a scale not seen since Cannae. The core of the empire's professional fighting force was gone. So what if Valens had shown patience? What if he had waited for the Western reinforcements, or chosen a more defensible position, or even negotiated a truce? A Roman victory at Adrianople would have broken the Gothic Confederation and reasserted imperial authority along the entire Danube. This was not just another border skirmish, it was a battle for the empire's demographic and military soul. The victory convinced the Goths and other tribes that the legendary Roman legions could be beaten, encouraging further invasions and settlement within imperial borders. These groups did not want to destroy the empire, they wanted its land and its wealth, and Adrianople proved they could take it. With a stable and secure eastern frontier, the wealthier half of the empire could have consistently propped up its struggling western counterpart. The Western Roman Empire did not fall from a single blow, but from 1,000 cuts, a slow bleed of territory, revenue, and military prestige. A strong Eastern army could have repeatedly shored up the defenses of Italy, Gaul, and Spain, repelling later invaders like the Vandals. The political fragmentation of Western Europe, the event we call the fall of Rome, might have been delayed for centuries. The Dark Ages, with their collapse of long-distance trade, centralized administration, and literacy, were not an inevitable descent. They were the direct result of a power vacuum. A surviving Western Roman Empire, even in a reduced form, would have maintained the framework of Roman law, Latin language, and urban life. The vast cultural and scientific knowledge preserved in Constantinople would have flowed more freely westward, potentially averting the loss of so much classical learning. The map of Europe might never have shattered into the patchwork of feudal kingdoms that took centuries to rebuild. The Battle of Adrianople was the moment the door was kicked in, and the tides that would eventually drown the Western Empire began their relentless, irreversible flow. Adrianople had kicked the door in, but half a century later, a new force arrived to sack the house. From the vastness of the Central Asian steppes came Attila the Hun, a man the terrified Romans called the Scourge of God. His mobile army of horse archers had carved a path of destruction through the Eastern Empire, extorting vast sums of gold. But in 451, his gaze turned west toward the heart of Gaul, a land already teetering on the edge of collapse. His goal was not just plunder but conquest. The Roman general Aetius, a man who had once been a hostage among the Huns and understood their ways, faced an impossible task. The Western Roman army was a ghost of its former self. To stand against the Hunnic tide, Aetius had to forge an alliance with the very barbarian tribes who had been settling and fracturing the empire for generations. He assembled a coalition of Visigoths, Franks, Alans, and even some Saxons, a fragile union of former enemies united by a common, terrifying foe. The two colossal forces met on the Catalonian plains near the city of Chalons. This was not a battle of Roman legions against barbarian hordes. It was a battle of two barbarian armies, one led by a Roman, for the soul of what was left of the Western world. The fighting was a chaotic, day-long melee of incredible ferocity. The Visigothic king, Theodoric, was killed in the cavalry charge, yet his men fought on. One flank of the battle surged back and forth over a ridge so steepened with blood that the chronicles describe it as a mountain of the slain. By nightfall, the Huns were driven back to their fortified camp, but Aetius' coalition was too bloodied to assault it. Attila, expecting a final attack the next morning, prepared a funeral pyre of saddles, ready to throw himself into the flames rather than be captured. But the attack never came. Aetius, ever the political strategist, convinced his allies to let the Huns retreat. He believed a weakened but surviving Attila was a useful counterbalance to the growing power of his own Visigothic allies. It was a calculated move of cold, realpolitik genius. But what if that calculation had failed? What if Attila's final, desperate charge had broken the Roman center? Or if the Visigoths had lost heart after their king's death? A Hunnic victory at Chalons would have shattered the last effective Roman-led army in the west. With Aetius dead and his coalition scattered, nothing would have stood between Attila and Rome itself. He would have sacked the Eternal City not in 455 by the Vandals, but in 451 with a far larger and more destructive force. This was not a tribe looking for a new homeland, but a steppe confederation built for extraction and domination. A Hunnic empire stretching from the grasslands of Hungary to the Atlantic coast of Gaul would have fundamentally rewritten the ethnic and linguistic map of Europe. The Latin-speaking population might have been subsumed or pushed into isolated pockets, much like the Celtic languages were by Latin centuries earlier. The dialects that would become French, Spanish, and Italian could have been stillborn, replaced by a mosaic of Turkic and Germanic tongues under a Hunnic overlay. The very concept of Christendom, still in its infancy, would have faced a pagan overlord with no interest in its theological debates. The Huns did not build for the ages, they extracted and moved on, but their political dominance could have lasted for generations, long enough to permanently alter the demographic currents that defined post-Roman Europe. The fragile alliance on the Catalonian plains did not save the Roman Empire, but it did save the possibility of a Europe that would one day emerge from its ruins. The sands of the Levant had witnessed the march of empires for centuries, yet the storm that gathered in the summer of 636 was something entirely new. The Byzantine Empire, having just exhausted itself in a long and brutal war against its ancient rival, Persia, now faced an unexpected and ferocious enemy from the southern deserts. This was the army of the Rashidun Caliphate, united by a powerful new faith and driven by a conviction that seemed to burn hotter than the desert sun. The fate of the Christian Middle East would be decided not at a fortified city, but in a deep ravine near the Yarmouk River. For days, the two massive armies probed and skirmished, the Byzantines confident in their heavy cataphract cavalry and their professional infantry, the tagmata. They were the heirs of Rome, disciplined and armored. The Muslim forces, led by the brilliant general Khalid ibn al-Walid, were lighter, faster, and fought with a religious fervor the Byzantines struggled to comprehend. The battle turned on the fifth day, in the middle of a blinding dust storm. Khalid, seeing his moment, launched his mobile cavalry reserves in a series of devastating hammer blows against the Byzantine flanks. The cataphracts, weighed down by their armor and disoriented by the sand-choked air, were surrounded and cut down. The Byzantine lines, pressed from all sides, collapsed into a rout. Thousands were driven over the steep ravines to their deaths, a catastrophic defeat that sealed the loss of Syria and Palestine forever. A single Byzantine victory here could have changed everything. If their cavalry had held the line, or if a single arrow had found Khalid in the chaos, the nascent Islamic Caliphate might have been thrown back into the desert, its momentum shattered. The ancient empires of Byzantium and Persia, though weakened, would have retained their grip on the Middle East. The great cities of Damascus, Jerusalem, and Alexandria would have remained firmly within the sphere of Orthodox Christianity. The religious map of the world would be drawn in profoundly different colors. Without the rapid spread of Islam across the Levant, North Africa, and Persia, the great theological and cultural dialogue that defined the medieval Mediterranean would never have occurred. The intellectual treasures of the Greeks, preserved and expanded upon by Islamic scholars in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, might have remained locked away in dwindling Byzantine libraries, their knowledge lost to a Europe descending into its dark ages. The Crusades, a direct response to Muslim control of the Holy Land, would have no reason to exist. The eternal city of Constantinople might never have fallen to the Ottoman Turks, remaining the majestic capital of a Christian empire that stretched across Anatolia. The Battle of Yarmouk was not merely a shift of territory. It was a tectonic collision that created a new spiritual continent, one whose borders we still live with today. The storm that broke the Byzantines at Yarmouk continued its westward surge, its momentum carrying it across the Strait of Gibraltar and into the heart of Visigothic Spain. Within a few short years, the Umayyad Caliphate had subdued most of the Iberian Peninsula, creating the vibrant province of Al-Andalus. Their gaze then turned north beyond the jagged wall of the Pyrenees to the fertile lands of Francia, a kingdom fractured by the feuds of its ruling Merovingian dynasty. In the autumn of 732, a powerful Muslim raiding force, rich with plunder from sacked churches, pushed deep into Aquitaine. It seemed that nothing could stop their advance into the very heart of Western Christendom. But waiting for them in the rolling countryside between Poitiers and Tours was a man who would become known as the Hammer, Charles Martel. He was not a king, but the mayor of the palace, the true power behind the throne, and he understood that this was a battle for survival. He assembled an army of Frankish veterans, men who fought on foot in the Germanic tradition, a solid wall of iron and flesh. The Umayyad army, by contrast, relied on its swift and skilled cavalry, a force that had proven devastating across Spain and North Africa. When the two forces met, the Umayyad horsemen launched charge after charge against the Frankish line. But Charles had chosen his ground perfectly, positioning his men on a wooded hill that disrupted the cavalry's momentum. His disciplined infantry, fighting with a desperate ferocity to defend their homeland, held firm against the onslaught. The battle was a brutal, grinding affair, a test of shields and spears against lance and scimitar. By the end of the day, the Umayyad commander was dead, and his army, shattered, retreated south, abandoning their vast plunder. The Frankish victory was so complete that it effectively ended major Muslim expansion north of the Pyrenees. Now consider the world if that line of Frankish shields had broken under the final cavalry charge. A triumphant Umayyad army, its ranks swollen with victory, would have found a fractured and leaderless Francia ripe for conquest. The great cities of Lyon, Paris, and even the holy site of Tours itself could have fallen under Muslim rule, establishing a new northern frontier for Al-Andalus. The cultural and religious landscape of Western Europe would have been transformed beyond recognition. Instead of Latin Christendom slowly consolidating under the Frankish kings, the continent would have been divided. The great medieval monasteries that preserved classical knowledge, the very institutions that would later fuel the Carolingian Renaissance, might have been lost or repurposed. The linguistic evolution of the region would be utterly different. Would the language of Paris today be a Romance dialect infused with Arabic, much like Spanish, rather than the French we know? The political consequences are even more profound. Charles Martel's victory cemented his family's power, paving the way for his grandson, Charlemagne, to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, an event that created a central pillar of European identity for 1,000 years. Without that victory, there is no Charlemagne, no Holy Roman Empire, and no powerful papal-Frankish alliance to define Western Christendom. The center of European power might have shifted permanently to the British Isles or the Germanic North, forever isolated from a Mediterranean world now dominated by a different faith. The battle at Tours was not just a military engagement. It was the moment the future of an entire civilization was decided by the unyielding courage of a few thousand men standing shoulder to shoulder on a French hilltop. The Frankish shield wall had held at Tours, preserving a Christian Europe, but a new and different kind of terror now descended from the northern seas. Longships, sleek and dragon-proud, slid up the Seine River in the spring of 845, a fleet of 120 vessels carrying thousands of Viking warriors. Their target was Paris, the symbolic heart of the Frankish kingdom, a city whose bridges and island fortress made it a prize of immense strategic and spiritual value. The West Frankish king, Charles the Bald, was utterly unprepared. His realm was fractured by internal rivalries, and he could not muster a force in time to defend the city. The Vikings laid siege, their ruthless efficiency a stark contrast to the disorganized Frankish response. They stormed the left bank, sacked the abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and hanged 111 of its defenders in a gruesome display meant to shatter morale. Faced with the complete destruction of his capital, Charles the Bald chose a path of desperate pragmatism. He offered the Vikings a payment of 7,000 pounds of silver and gold to simply go away. This was the Danegeld, a ransom for a kingdom's survival. The Norsemen, their ships heavy with loot and their objective achieved, accepted the payment and withdrew. But what if Charles had chosen to fight, or if the city's defenders had faltered just a day sooner, allowing the Vikings to take the entire city by storm? A permanent Viking conquest of Paris in 845 would have planted a Norse kingdom directly in the fertile Seine Valley, the very core of Francia. This would not have been a mere raiding base, but a settled, powerful state controlling the riverine heart of the future France. The political fragmentation of the Frankish Empire, already advanced, would have become irreversible. The unity that Charlemagne had forged was brittle, and the loss of Paris would have shattered it completely. With a Scandinavian stronghold astride the Seine, the process of feudalization would have accelerated as local lords scrambled to defend their own lands without a central authority. The very name France, derived from the Franks, might never have come to define the nation. Instead of a kingdom slowly consolidating around the Isle de France and the Parisian Basin, we could have seen a permanent division, with a Norse-speaking Jarldom of Paris dominating the north and a rump Frankish state clinging to the south. The linguistic impact would be just as profound. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, would have mixed with the local Romance dialects on the most fundamental level, not at the fringes but at the center. The French language as we know it, a direct descendant of Latin, might have been stillborn, replaced by a hybrid tongue with a vastly different vocabulary and grammar. The cultural and political center of gravity in Western Europe would have shifted away from the Seine, potentially to the Rhine or elsewhere, forever altering the balance of power. The Danegeld brought a temporary peace, but it also established a dangerous precedent, teaching the Vikings that the Frankish kingdoms were rich, weak, and worth returning to for more. That first payment was a down payment on a future of relentless pressure, but it was a bargain compared to the world we almost lost, a world where the heart of France beat not in Paris but in a Viking long haul. The crown of England rested on a single arrow's flight. In the autumn of 1066, two armies faced each other on Senlac Hill near Hastings. King Harold Godwinson and his Anglo-Saxon housecarls stood exhausted but defiant, having just marched south at incredible speed after crushing a Viking invasion in the north. Now they faced a new threat, Duke William of Normandy and his disciplined force of armored knights and archers. The battle raged for hours, a brutal slog where the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, a tactic honed for generations, proved immensely difficult to break. The Normans feigned retreats, trying to lure the English from their high ground with only partial success. Harold's men held firm. The outcome hung in a precarious balance until, as the legend goes, a stray Norman arrow arced high into the sky and found its mark, striking the English king in the eye. The blow was fatal, and with their leader gone, the heart went out of the English army. The shield wall crumbled, and William secured his bloody victory, earning the title of conqueror. But what if that arrow had flown just a few inches wide, embedding itself harmlessly in a wooden shield? What if Harold had survived that critical moment? An Anglo-Saxon victory at Hastings would have meant a very different England, one rooted in its Germanic and Scandinavian past. The ruling class would have remained Anglo-Saxon, speaking a version of Old English, a tongue far closer to its Germanic cousins like Old Norse than to the Romance languages of the continent. The court, the laws, and the literature would have continued in that tradition. The most profound change would have been linguistic. The Norman conquest flooded English with tens of thousands of French words, creating the layered vocabulary we have today, where we might eat beef from a cow, the Saxon word for the animal and the French word for the meat. Without that massive infusion, modern English would sound utterly alien to our ears. It would be a harsher, more guttural language, lacking the Latin-based elegance that gives it such remarkable range. The very structure of society would have reflected this continuity. The deep class divide embedded in the language, where Saxon serfs tended the livestock and Norman lords enjoyed the cuisine, would never have formed. England's political and cultural orientation might have remained looking north and east toward Scandinavia rather than south toward France. This shift could have altered the dynamics of the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, and even the Age of Exploration. The English language itself, that global phenomenon, was forged in the crucible of defeat on a bloody hill. It exists as a hybrid because a single man fell and a world of words died with him. Jerusalem shimmered in the distance, a prize that had drawn armies and pilgrims for 1,000 years. But to reach it, the Knights of the First Crusade first had to conquer a fortress that seemed utterly unbreachable, the great city of Antioch. For 8 long months, from October 1097 to June 1098, the Crusader army was locked in a grueling siege. They were starving, diseased, and surrounded by a relief force from Mosul that seemed destined to crush them against the city walls. Morale had hit its lowest point, with many knights deserting and hope all but extinguished. Then, a minor nobleman named Bohemond of Taranto struck a secret deal with an Armenian guard inside the city who promised to open a tower gate. Under the cover of a moonless night, Bohemond's men scaled the walls, threw open the gates, and the city fell in a chaotic, bloody storm. Yet their triumph was short-lived. Just days later, they found themselves besieged within the very city they had just taken, trapped by a massive Muslim army. It was the discovery of a relic, the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced Christ's side, that reportedly reignited the Crusaders' fervor. In a desperate, almost suicidal sortie, the starving and outnumbered knights charged from the gates and somehow routed the besieging force. This miraculous victory cleared their path to Jerusalem. Now consider if that Armenian guard had been caught, or if the final desperate charge from Antioch had failed. Without the capture of Antioch, the entire First Crusade would have likely disintegrated in the Syrian desert, a forgotten footnote of religious fervor. There would have been no subsequent capture of Jerusalem, no establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem or the other Crusader states. The Holy Land would have remained under the control of various Muslim dynasties, its political and religious landscape evolving without the disruptive presence of a militant Christian colony in its heart. The profound cultural and religious schism that the Crusader states represented would never have been carved so deeply into the collective memory of both faiths. The very concept of a holy war to reclaim the birthplace of Christ, having failed so utterly on its first attempt, might have lost its political and spiritual appeal in Europe. Would there have been a second crusade, a third, if the first had ended in total disaster before even reaching its goal? The centuries of conflict that define the relationship between Christendom and Islam, conflicts that bred lasting mistrust and shaped colonial-era attitudes, might have been averted. The great military orders like the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, founded to protect pilgrims traveling to a Christian-held Jerusalem, would never have formed, altering the financial and military history of medieval Europe. The vibrant, if fraught, cultural exchange that occurred in the Crusader states, where Italian merchants traded goods and Eastern knowledge slowly filtered back to the West, would have been stillborn. The world was reshaped not just by the Crusaders' eventual success, but by a single traitorous act at a gate in Antioch, a moment of betrayal that opened the door to 2 centuries of holy war. 2 typhoons of almost biblical fury saved Japan from the Mongol horde. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis and ruler of the vast Mongol Empire, had set his sights on the island nation after subjugating Korea. His first invasion fleet in 1274 was formidable, carrying tens of thousands of troops, but after initial successes on the beaches of Kyushu, a violent storm wrecked many of their ships, forcing a retreat. The Mongols returned 7 years later with one of the largest invasion fleets ever assembled, a colossal armada said to have numbered over 4,000 ships. The samurai defenders, fighting with desperate courage, were pushed to the brink, holding their defensive walls against overwhelming odds. Then the heavens intervened again. A second, even more powerful typhoon, a kamikaze or divine wind, smashed the Mongol fleet to splinters, drowning the vast majority of the invasion force. This double deliverance cemented the belief that Japan was a divinely protected land, a belief that would fuel its national identity for centuries. What if those storms had arrived just a week later, or the seas had remained calm? A successful Mongol invasion would have shattered Japan's political and cultural isolation. The shogunate, the military government of the samurai, would have been dismantled and replaced by a Mongol governor. The intricate feudal system, built on the loyalty of daimyo lords to the shogun, would have been reorganized to serve the Great Khan, its taxes flowing to Karakoram or Beijing. The samurai warrior class, defined by its strict code of Bushido, would have faced an existential crisis. Would they have been absorbed into the Mongol military machine, their katana swords set aside for the composite bow and tactics of the steppe? Or would their culture have been systematically suppressed, their castles torn down to prevent rebellion? The profound influence of Zen Buddhism on the samurai arts, from the tea ceremony to ink painting, might have been diluted or replaced by the different spiritual traditions of the Mongol court. Japan would have become another province in a sprawling continental empire, its unique trajectory broken. Without that hard-won isolation, the Japan that later fascinated the West with its unique art, literature, and social structures might never have developed. The kamikaze were not merely weather events, they were the guardians of a future that would remain uniquely Japanese for 700 more years. For over a century, the fields of France were soaked in the blood of English kings and French nobles, a dynastic struggle that became a brutal war of national identity. The 100 Years' War was not a single conflict but a series of devastating campaigns, a relentless tug of war over the crown of France itself. The English, with their revolutionary longbowmen, repeatedly humiliated the heavily armored French chivalry on battlefields like Crécy and Poitiers. Yet no victory was more stunning or more seemingly decisive than the one on a muddy field near Agincourt. On a day of torrential rain in 1415, a small, sick, and exhausted English army led by King Henry V found itself trapped by a vastly larger French force. The French knights, confident in their numbers and their heavy plate armor, chose to attack across a recently plowed field churned into a deep bog by the downpour. It was a catastrophic error. As the knights slogged forward, their advance slowed to a crawl in the clinging mud. The English longbowmen unleashed a storm of arrows, a cloud so thick it darkened the sky. The arrows themselves could not always pierce the plate armor, but they killed the knights' horses and found the weak points in visors and armor joints. The French vanguard, packed tightly and immobilized, was slaughtered. The English men-at-arms then moved in, dispatching the helpless, exhausted nobles with knives and mallets. It was less a battle than a massacre, a triumph of the common yeoman archer over the flower of French aristocracy. This victory led directly to the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited the French Dauphin and named Henry V and his heirs as the legitimate successors to the French throne. For a brief, incredible moment, a dual monarchy of England and France seemed not just possible but inevitable. So what if Henry had lived to consolidate his astonishing victory? He died just 2 years later, leaving an infant son, and the French spirit, ignited by Joan of Arc, eventually rallied to expel the English. But if Henry had ruled for another 20 or 30 years, that personal union of crowns could have hardened into a permanent political reality. England and France would have been united under a single monarch, a super-state controlling both sides of the Channel. The consequences would have reshaped the world. A united Anglo-French kingdom would have been the undisputed superpower of 15th century Europe, its resources undivided by constant warfare. The endless drain of men and money that crippled both nations would have been redirected. Instead of fighting each other, their combined armies and navies could have projected power anywhere on the continent, potentially stifling the rise of rival powers like Spain and the Holy Roman Empire before they even began. The internal dynamics would have been equally transformative. The English language, already heavily influenced by French after the Norman conquest, would have absorbed even more, perhaps evolving into a truly hybrid tongue. The cultural and legal traditions of both nations would have slowly fused, but the most profound change might have been across the Atlantic. With its continental security assured, this dual monarchy could have launched the age of exploration with unprecedented focus and capital. The voyages of discovery, instead of being a competition between Spain, Portugal, England, and France, might have been a single, colossal enterprise. Imagine a single flag planted in the New World, not of Castile or England, but of the Anglo-French crown. The entire colonization of the Americas, the languages spoken from Quebec to the Caribbean, the very political landscape of the modern world would be unrecognizable. The future of two hemispheres was decided not only on the battlefields of France, but in the fragile health of a single king whose grand design died with him. The great walls of Constantinople had stood unbreached for 1,000 years, a monument to Roman engineering and the final bastion of a dying empire. By the spring of 1453, the Byzantine Empire was a hollow shell, a city-state surrounded by a rising Ottoman power. Sultan Mehmed II, a young man of immense ambition, was determined to make the legendary city his capital. He brought to its walls a weapon of terrifying scale, a massive bronze cannon that could shatter the ancient stonework, and an army that dwarfed the few thousand defenders. For 54 days, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, directed a desperate defense, plugging gaps in the walls as the massive cannonballs slammed home. The end came not from the great gun, but through a single, forgotten gate left open after a skirmish. Ottoman troops poured in, and the last Roman emperor vanished into the fray, dying sword in hand. The fall of the city sent a shockwave of terror through Christendom. But what if that gate had been secured, or if a Venetian relief fleet had arrived just days sooner? A successful defense would have preserved the Byzantine Empire as a Christian bulwark for decades, perhaps even centuries longer. The Ottoman drive into Europe would have been blunted, its energy potentially diverted eastward against other rivals. This single change would have reshaped the cultural destiny of the West. In the years following the actual fall, a flood of Greek scholars fled Constantinople for Italy, carrying with them precious ancient manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for a millennium. This exodus of knowledge and intellectual firepower is widely credited with fueling the Italian Renaissance, igniting a rebirth of classical learning that transformed art, science, and philosophy. Had Constantinople held, that intellectual transfer might have been a slow trickle rather than a tidal wave. Would Leonardo da Vinci have studied the same texts? Would Michelangelo have sculpted with the same inspiration without the urgent, concentrated arrival of this ancient wisdom? The Renaissance might have been delayed or taken a different, less Hellenistic form. The very shape of modern thought was cast in the shadow of those crumbling walls as the last light of Rome was extinguished to illuminate a new dawn in the West. While the fall of Constantinople reshaped the intellectual map of Europe, another dynastic storm was brewing on a misty island that would define its political future for centuries. In England, the long and bloody Wars of the Roses pitted two rival branches of the royal Plantagenet family against each other, the House of York with its white rose and the House of Lancaster with its red. This was not a war of nations, but a brutal family feud fought by armored knights and private armies, a 3-decade-long carnage that decimated the English nobility. The final act of this saga unfolded on a field near the small town of Market Bosworth in August 1485. On one side stood the Yorkist king, Richard III, a seasoned commander with a larger army. On the other was the relatively unknown Henry Tudor, the last Lancastrian claimant, who had spent most of his life in exile. The battle was a chaotic melee of clashing men and thundering horses, its outcome swayed not by grand strategy, but by the sudden, fateful betrayal of Lord Stanley and his powerful forces. Stanley, who had been waiting on the sidelines, finally threw his weight behind Henry Tudor at the critical moment. Richard, seeing his chance to end the fight with a single, desperate charge, spurred his horse directly toward Henry. He fought his way to within a sword's length of his rival before being overwhelmed and cut down. With his death, the Plantagenet line ended, and Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII on the spot, founding the dynasty that would bear his name. This single betrayal decided the fate of a nation. But what if Lord Stanley had remained loyal to King Richard? What if that final, heroic charge had succeeded and Richard's sword had found its mark? A Yorkist victory at Bosworth Field would have kept the Tudor family in obscurity. There would have been no King Henry VIII and no Elizabeth I. The entire religious and colonial destiny of England would have been rewritten. The English Reformation, that monumental break with the Catholic Church in Rome, was almost entirely the project of the Tudor monarchs, driven by Henry VIII's desire for a divorce. Under a continuing Yorkist dynasty, England would almost certainly have remained a Catholic kingdom, loyal to the Pope. This single fact would have reoriented its entire foreign policy, aligning it with Spain and the Holy Roman Empire rather than setting it against them as a Protestant rival. There would have been no need for the Spanish Armada, no persecution of Catholic dissenters, and no King James Bible, the book that so profoundly shaped the English language. The cultural identity of England, and by extension its American colonies, would be fundamentally different. And what of the age of exploration? The Elizabethan era, with its sea dogs and global ambition, was a product of Tudor policy and personality. Without Elizabeth on the throne, would English ships have challenged Spanish dominance in the New World? Would there have been a Walter Raleigh to name Virginia, or a Francis Drake to circumnavigate the globe? A Catholic Yorkist England, firmly within the Spanish and Catholic sphere of influence, might have been a junior partner in the colonization of the Americas, rather than a fierce competitor. The language spoken in North America might well be Spanish, and the United States, if it existed at all, would be a nation built on a completely different religious and cultural foundation. The world we know was shaped not just by kings who won, but by one who fell on a muddy field, his crown tumbling into a thorn bush picked up by a dynasty that should never have been. The fate of dynasties in Europe was decided by betrayal and battle, but across the Atlantic, an entire world was about to be erased. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with a force of fewer than 600 conquistadors, a handful of horses, and a few cannons. He was marching into the heart of a powerful empire, the Aztec Triple Alliance, which commanded the loyalty of millions and ruled from a magnificent island city larger than any in Europe. The idea that this tiny band could conquer such a realm was pure madness, yet they did. Their success relied on a perfect, terrible storm of factors, from the ruthless ambition of Cortés and his mastery of psychological warfare to the deep-seated resentment of the many peoples the Aztecs had subjugated. These allied tribes saw the Spaniards not as liberators, but as a useful new weapon in their own ancient feuds. But one element of this storm was invisible, silent, and utterly devastating: disease. Smallpox, carried unwittingly by one of the Spanish soldiers, swept through the Americas. It was a plague for which the indigenous population had zero immunity. It ravaged cities, killed warriors and farmers alike, and most crucially, it claimed the Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac just as he was organizing a fierce resistance after the death of his predecessor, Moctezuma. The pathogen acted as a silent, unstoppable 16th Legion for the Spanish, decimating the opposition before a single sword was drawn. But what if that ship had never carried the virus to those shores? A Mexico free of smallpox would have presented Cortés with an entirely different reality. The Aztec military structure would have remained intact, its leadership unified and determined. The Spanish faced their darkest hour during La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, when they were driven from the capital of Tenochtitlan in a desperate, bloody retreat across the causeways, losing most of their men and treasure. That was the moment the conquest could have and should have ended. If the Aztec pursuit had been just a little more relentless, if they had destroyed every last Spanish survivor, the story ends there. A defeated and dead Cortés becomes a cautionary tale, a ghost story of the strange, bearded men from the East. Without the catastrophic depopulation from disease, the Spanish would have found it impossible to rally enough local allies. Who would side with a clearly defeated and dwindling force against the restored power of the Aztec Empire? The psychological impact of the Spanish would have been broken. The knowledge of these new invaders, their horses, and their guns would have spread, of course, but it would have given the civilizations of Mesoamerica something they never had in our timeline: time. Time to study these new threats, to adapt their own tactics, and to forge new alliances on their own terms. The next Spanish expedition would have encountered a fortified and prepared continent, its peoples united by the shared experience of having repelled the first wave. The independent development of Mesoamerican cultures could have continued for decades, even centuries. The great cities of the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Purépecha would have endured, their unique writing systems, astronomical knowledge, and architectural styles evolving without the brutal interruption of colonial rule. The world would have inherited a hemisphere with a profoundly different cultural and genetic landscape, a tapestry woven from threads that were, in our reality, cut short by a pathogen and a single night of escape. The same invisible weapon that shattered the Aztec world was already sailing south. Francisco Pizarro and his 168 conquistadors entered the highland city of Cajamarca in 1532 to find it nearly empty. The Inca Emperor Atahualpa, fresh from a brutal civil war, was camped with his army of tens of thousands just outside the city walls. He had agreed to a meeting, viewing the small band of strangers as a curiosity, not a threat. The scene that followed was not a battle, but an ambush of chilling audacity. From the silent, enclosed square, Spanish cavalry erupted, their horses and steel armor a terrifying spectacle to the Inca soldiers who had never seen such things. The conquistadors' guns and cannons roared, creating panic and confusion. Pizarro's men surged forward, their single goal to capture the emperor himself. They seized Atahualpa from his royal litter, slaughtering his unarmed attendants by the thousands in a matter of hours. The Sopa Inca, the living god of the largest empire in the Americas, was now a prisoner. His captors would eventually execute him, despite him fulfilling his legendary ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver. The Spanish, through this one act of political decapitation, seized control of an empire's vast infrastructure. But what if Atahualpa had been more wary? What if he had simply never entered that trap at Cajamarca? An Inca victory that day would not have required a complex military maneuver. It would have required only a different decision, a king's intuition to keep his distance. With their emperor safe and their army intact, the Inca response would have been swift and overwhelming. The Spanish, isolated and deep in the Andes, would have been hunted down and destroyed. The consequences of such an outcome are almost incalculable. The Inca Empire was a marvel of engineering and administration, connected by a network of mountain roads rivaling that of Rome. It possessed advanced agricultural techniques, monumental architecture, and a complex societal structure. Without the Spanish conquest, this empire would have endured. The demographic catastrophe that followed the conquistadors, the plagues that killed millions, might have been delayed or even mitigated, allowing the indigenous population to maintain its numbers and strength. The cultural landscape of South America would be a tapestry woven from Inca rather than European threads. The primary language from Ecuador to Chile might be Quechua, not Spanish. The cities of Lima and Quito would have developed as Inca metropolises, their central plazas dominated by temples to entie the sun god instead of Catholic cathedrals. The flow of history would have been redirected. The vast silver mines of Potosi, whose wealth flooded Europe and funded its wars, would have remained under Inca control, never triggering the price revolution that reshaped the European economy. The independent nations of the Andes would have emerged from a continuous indigenous civilization, with a wholly different relationship to land, community, and governance. The Spanish conquest was not an inevitable tide, but a fragile gamble that succeeded through a single, perfectly executed act of treachery. The future of a continent was held hostage in a single room, its fate sealed not by armies but by the capture of one man. The chill of an early autumn settled over Vienna in 1529. A cold dread carried on the wind from the east. The greatest army in the world stood at its gates, an immense force of the Ottoman Empire led by its most celebrated sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. His goal was not merely another city, it was the very gateway to Europe. Vienna was the stopper in the bottle, and if it fell, the political and religious map of the continent would be redrawn forever. Suleiman's advance had been swift and terrifying, his elite janissaries and massed cavalry sweeping through Hungary. The Viennese defenders, a mix of German landsknechts and local militia, were heavily outnumbered. Their only hope lay in the city's medieval walls and the onset of bad weather. The Ottomans launched assault after assault, their sappers digging mines beneath the fortifications while cannons pounded the stone. Yet the defenders, led by the seasoned commander Nicholas Graf Salm, fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no retreat. They flooded the tunnels, repelled scaling ladders, and endured a relentless barrage. The turning point was not a glorious charge, but the slow, grinding arrival of the Central European autumn. Rains turned the Ottoman camp into a sea of mud, bogging down supplies and sickening the troops. With his army weakening and a harsh winter looming, Suleiman was forced to concede. He ordered a full retreat, abandoning his massive cannon train in the mud. The siege was over, but what if the weather had held for just 2 more weeks? What if a single Ottoman mine had succeeded in collapsing a critical section of the wall? A victorious Suleiman would have marched into a city stripped of its last defenders. Vienna would have become a new Ottoman province, a Muslim bastion deep in the heart of Christendom. This was not a temporary raid, it was a move of permanent conquest. The Danube River, the great commercial artery of Central Europe, would have become an Ottoman waterway. From this new base, Ottoman armies could have pushed north into the rich, fragmented lands of Germany. Could the quarreling princes of the Holy Roman Empire, already divided by the Protestant Reformation, have united against such a powerful, organized foe? It seems unlikely. The advance may have continued, potentially reaching the Rhine and altering the cultural boundary between East and West for centuries. The very identity of Europe was at stake. Without Vienna as a bulwark, the vibrant center of classical music from Mozart to Beethoven might never have flourished in the same way. The coffee houses that later defined Viennese intellectual life would have served a different clientele under the shadow of minarets. The religious balance of the continent would have tipped dramatically, creating a permanent Islamic power in Central Europe, just as the Protestant Reformation was tearing the old Catholic unity apart. The clash of faiths would have been immediate and existential, fought not in distant lands but in the fields of Bavaria and the forests of Bohemia. The world breathed a sigh of relief when the Ottoman banners withdrew from Vienna, but it was a close-run thing, a victory decided as much by rain and mud as by sword and courage. The Mediterranean Sea had become an Ottoman lake. For decades, their fleets had ruled the waves, raiding the coasts of Italy and Spain with impunity, and turning the great inland sea into a highway for their corsairs. The Christian powers of Europe, fractured by the rising tide of the Protestant Reformation, seemed unable to mount a unified defense, but in 1571 a fragile coalition answered the call. The Holy League, an alliance of Spain, Venice, and the Papal States, assembled a massive fleet to confront the Ottoman navy off the coast of Greece, near the Gulf of Lepanto. This would be the last great clash of oar-powered galleys, a brutal, close-quarters melee where ships became floating fortresses, locked in a desperate struggle of boarding parties and point-blank cannon fire. The air was thick with the smell of salt, smoke, and fear. On the morning of October 7th, the two armadas sighted each other, a forest of masts and oars stretching to the horizon. The Christian fleet, under the command of Don John of Austria, flew banners of the crucifix. The Ottoman fleet, led by Ali Pasha, flew the crescent standard of the Sultan. What followed was not a battle of maneuver, but a colossal ship-to-ship brawl. Galleys rammed into one another, their bows bristling with cannons firing a single, devastating volley before the marines and archers took over. The water turned crimson, choked with splintered wood and the wreckage of proud vessels. The fighting was ferocious, a swirling chaos where the fate of continents hung in the balance. At the critical moment, the Christian left wing, though badly mauled, held fast against a fierce Ottoman flanking attack. This allowed the center to prevail, and Ali Pasha's flagship was boarded and captured, his head mounted on a pike. The sight shattered Ottoman morale, and their fleet was routed. It was a stunning, decisive victory for the Holy League. Now, consider the world if that left wing had broken, if a single Ottoman galley had turned the flank. A victorious Ottoman fleet at Lepanto would have annihilated the last major naval force standing against it. With no Christian navy left to challenge them, the Ottoman Empire would have achieved absolute mastery of the Mediterranean. Their corsairs would have ruled the sea lanes unchecked, strangling the trade that was the lifeblood of Italian cities like Venice and Genoa. The coasts of Spain, southern France, and Italy would have lived under constant threat of invasion, their ports blockaded and their people carried off into slavery. The rich intellectual and artistic ferment of the Italian Renaissance, already waning, might have been snuffed out entirely under the shadow of this existential threat. The flow of wealth and ideas that fueled artists and thinkers would have dried up. Perhaps even more profound would have been the impact on the religious strife tearing Europe apart. The Catholic Church, which had championed and funded the Holy League, would have been utterly discredited by a catastrophic defeat. How could it claim divine favor after such a loss? The Protestant Reformation, already gaining ground in the north, would have been emboldened, viewing the defeat as a clear sign of God's judgment against a corrupt papacy. The Catholic Reformation, the Church's own internal movement of renewal, might have collapsed before it truly began. The spiritual and political unity of southern Europe could have fractured beyond repair, leaving it vulnerable and divided before a triumphant Ottoman power. The course of Western civilization was secured not just by courage and cannon, but by the stubborn resilience of a single battle line holding fast against the tide. Our journey across these ancient battlefields reveals a world built on a knife's edge. The languages we speak, the faiths we follow, the very maps we navigate were not preordained. They are the legacy of 1,000 fragile moments, any one of which could have broken differently. A single arrow spared Harold Godwinson at Hastings, and English might sound closer to German. A gate left unguarded in Constantinople preserved the Roman Empire for another century. A king's hesitation outside the walls of Rome allowed a republic to become an empire that would shape the Western world. These are not just military footnotes, they are the fault lines of reality itself. Consider how much of our modern life rests on the outcome of a long run at Marathon, a desperate charge at Tours, or a divine wind off the coast of Japan. It forces us to acknowledge the breathtaking fragility of our shared history. The tapestry of our past is woven with threads so delicate that a single decision, a stray arrow, or a sudden shift in the weather could have unraveled it all, leaving us with a present we would scarcely recognize. So we turn the question to you. Which of these near misses captures your imagination the most? What other hinge of ancient history do you believe could have sent our world spiraling down a completely different path? Share your own favorite what-if scenario in the comments below. The story of our past is a collection of countless possibilities, and we have only just begun to explore them